Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, a year and a half after the spill, Alberton spill victims got their first meeting with ATSDR and their first chance to vent complaints at a public meeting since their return home. But Lucinda Hodges and others were shocked to find that ATSDR had already planned an upcoming follow-up health study without input from the residents. We now continue with Part 3, Chapter 6, Runaway. Soon after 6:30 p.m. on November 17, 1997, a news crawl on Missoula television screens elicited clucking tongues. In others, it stirred fear. An MRL train had just left the yard at Garrison, some 65 miles east. Over a mile and a quarter long, the train had no crew and ran backward, downstream on gravity and gaining momentum. "Runaway train," warned the TV, headed to Missoula. If the train survived the various curves leading to Hellgate Canyon, it would shoot straight into MRL's yard, sandwiched between the downtown North Side homes and Interstate 90. Almost 9 years earlier, an MRL Runaway escaped Mullen Pass and ran back into Helena at full speed. Exploding tanks caused millions of dollars in damage and shattered windows miles away. 3,500 people evacuated. The derailment included several chlorine cars, though none ruptured. No one died. Now, MRL faced an inescapable decision: where to derail this train. A subsequent news crawl informed the train had 107 cars, but gave no information on what was in them. Since Alberton's spill, it became common knowledge around Missoula that virtually every train carried hazardous materials, and on any given train, only the railroad knew for sure what was aboard. And sometimes, even MRL didn't seem all that certain. Paul Lazy, Rural Fire Operations Chief for Missoula County, heard from MRL that chlorine and other hazardous materials were on this train, but the information hadn't been clear. Once again, a communication problem with MRL. Once again, a train presented a chlorine threat. As the rogue train passed Gold Creek, racing the dark waters in the adjacent Clark Fork River, observant motorists on I-90 took pause at locomotive lights, bringing up the rear instead of illuminating the path forward. Now there was talk on television of intentional derailment. Already the Runaway had passed through Drummond, 47 miles distant. Where would they do it? After Clinton, 15 miles outside Missoula, the populated areas on the city's outskirts scrunched together in the Pinching Valley, and concern grew that the train might catastrophically jump track as it whipped the curves. The townsfolk of Bonner, Milltown, West Riverside, and East Missoula might find themselves ineligible as a control group for ATSDR's Phase 2 study. As the train gathered speed, text was abruptly replaced by live newscasters with concerned faces, informing Missoula the train was headed to town at 50 miles an hour. "We will keep you posted," anchors promised. Deputies blocked rail crossings in the path of the Runaway. One television station sent scouts out and broadcast eerie footage of the train roaring backwards through the night. Outlying communities readied for evacuations. State police set up a rolling roadblock of I-90. In Missoula, hazmat crews mobilized. Where would MRL derail the train without a brain? At home in her Northside Missoula trailer, some quarter mile from the MRL yard, Lucinda Hodges cooked dinner while the family watched TV. In the split second it took to process the news, she froze like a jacklit deer. "My immediate reaction was to leave. Get out before it hits. I told the kids to get their blankets, to get the basics. We were going to get out until we knew what was going to happen," she said. Holy God, she felt stalked by MRL's goddamn trains. As did the Madges, who had moved into their Rock Creek home near Clinton in October. "We felt positively persecuted," Katina recalled ruefully. The Chalmers, now living at Ada's mother's house on Mullen Road, also prepared to evacuate. Hodges' Missoula neighbors weren't concerned. They just assumed someone would take care of the situation. But that feeling of trust, Her naivety was long emptied from her. Before we actually got out the door, it came across the TV that they had a controlled derailment, Hodges noted with irony. Jesus Christ. MRL responders threw a switch at the Bonita Spur sighting some 5 miles east of Rock Creek. The switch had to be thrown manually, and then the response crew stood back, way back. It would be no small excitement for a 6,735-foot train bowling along at over 50 miles per hour to come to an abrupt halt. At a later emergency responder MRL meeting, Hodges said someone reported the Runaway reached speeds up to 90 miles an hour, 40 miles an hour above what was reported in the media. Tripping Goliath had consequences. The Alberton train, 4,319 feet long, had weighed over 11 million pounds, a comparative child. That 30-mile-per-hour derailment had ruptured a chlorine tanker considered to be virtually indestructible, not to mention easily splitting the weld seam of the Crestlate tanker. Locals heard a long series of concussions as 49 cars leapt the track, accompanied by bright flashes in the night, like space debris splattering the windshield of the atmosphere. When the thunder, shrieks, and groans died and everything stopped moving, the Renegade's lonely escape had been arrested 25 miles outside of Missoula. Chief Lazy said if the train hadn't been purposely derailed here, he had no idea where it might have been at greatest risk to crash on its own. After the bones of the behemoth settled, Missoula County Rural Fire responded with everything they had: ambulances, fire crews, hazmat, in case toxic or flammable loads had breached. They wouldn't know until they got there. Fire Battalion Chief Jess Mickelson wryly noted, MRL didn't want to have a repeat of Alberton, you know. To everyone's immense relief, they didn't. The chlorine tanker had not derailed, and only later did responders find out it was an empty, or residue tank. The worst immediate problem was a severed power line. That night on television, the representative that MRL sent forth for interviews was attorney Ron McDonald. He said that primarily wood products and empty cars had derailed. I can't tell you what other products were on the cars, he said. There were 2 cars at the front of the train, now the back, that did not derail, that did have hazardous materials, which McDonald didn't identify. Even the point man for MRL couldn't or wouldn't say what exactly had been on this train. Only the next day did reports surface that 10 derailed cars carried residual chemicals, gasoline and denatured alcohol that fortunately didn't spill or combust. An empty tanker could hold as much as 10% residual chemicals. In the case of a chlorine tanker, that could mean up to 18,000 pounds. To the great relief of everyone, the Missoulian reported, the mangled beast is not bleeding poison. If you're going to wreck a train, that was the best place to derail it, and the right train to derail, Lazy said, looking for the shiny side of the dodged bullet. This wasn't damning praise for MRL, but gratitude to the gods of chance. This time, it was the right place and the right train for a catastrophic derailment. A different roll of the die, and a chemical bomb could have exploded in Missoula's lap. When Lisa Mosca heard about the derailment, she grabbed a camera and drove toward the site. Though there were no reports of anything spilled, her trust level wasn't high regarding official assurances and train derailments, and she couldn't block the apprehension that she was driving the wrong damn way. For the second time in 19 months, an MRL derailment had closed I-90. By the time Mosca arrived at the site around 9 p.m., lanes were on the verge of reopening, and along with news crews, she was allowed to film the aftermath. Spotlights revealed an eerie assortment of outcomes for the sacrificed cars. Some lay in a neat perpendicular chorus line on the broken tracks, their butt ends lifted to face I-90, a stone's throw away. Other cars piled 2 to 4 or 5 deep in every imaginable attitude, up to 65 feet high. 300 feet of track had torn up. As one TV reporter put it, the massive mass of twisted metal and damaged supplies is the best possible outcome MRL could have hoped for. Everyone chewed on that. MRL couldn't yet account for the cause of its runaway. Dan Watts, MRL's vice president of operations, said the crew had stopped at Garrison to add a locomotive helper, and the train began to roll. MRL has never had this happen before, Watts said. To the contrary, the incident was reminiscent of the 1995 runaway from MRL's Livingston rail yard, in which 2 engines and 6 cars ran free for 2 hours before MRL removed a section of track just west of Laurel, Montana. That crew had neglected to set the brake. And on the first day of operations in 1987, MRL had a runaway that crossed up Bozeman Pass at 80 miles per hour before obliterating itself down an embankment on the other side. And then there was Helena. This was the 8th major derailment between Billings and Idaho on the MRL line in less than 2 years. 4 days later, MRL declared that engineers at Garrison failed to set the brakes properly. By the time they noticed the train slipping into the Clark Fork Valley and ran in pursuit, it was too late. MRL expected to have all the derailed cars untangled within 2 more weeks. Even the Missoulian ran a brief editorial critical of the runaway, which they noted could have produced another Alberton but for the lack of hazardous cargo. They wrote, "It's the result of random chance that people weren't killed or injured, whole communities weren't evacuated, and severe environmental damage wasn't inflicted." Everyone realized that anything could have been on that train, any given car, a 100-ton toxic grenade. Having witnessed the bookends of a major spill to the west and a runaway to the east in the span of a year and a half, Missoula had an uneasy feeling that the next shot might target them dead to rights. Only a week later did local emergency officials learn the specifics of MRL's plans during the runaway. Plan A had been to derail the train at Bearmouth, but the train ran ahead of that option. Another possibility had been the Nimrod sighting, but that was deemed too close to the Clark Fork River. If Bonita had failed, there was one last sighting option prior to Missoula, near Clinton, and then the very last option would have been letting the train fly through the Missoula rail yard on the north end of town and diverting it toward Evero Hill, northwest of town. But MRL felt the train would have crashed on its own, somewhere on the curves before Missoula. Missoula Police Chief Pete Larson expressed disturbing revelations that the first word he got about the emergency was that the train would be coming through Missoula at 50 miles per hour, and he couldn't get connected to anyone at MRL to get better information. "I just talked to myself for about 15 minutes, he said, and didn't get very good answers. The sheriff's office reported neither MRL nor the government entities knew each other's radio frequencies. This 18 months after the Alberton spill. 911 dispatch was overwhelmed, Larson said. Again. Even more disturbing, Ellen Leahy said the health department, which helped direct hazmat response, couldn't get a manifest showing what kinds of chemicals were on the train until 20 or 30 minutes after it had derailed. Missoula officials had had no idea what hurtled towards them. During a meeting with officials, MRL promised to improve communications, help develop better railroad-related maps, and to participate in joint training sessions between officials and MRL emergency crews. The Alberton chemical spill hadn't been incentive enough. Newscasters announced that the accident rate of MRL was almost double the national average between 1990 and 1995. In a letter to the editor, a Clinton resident who lived at the Bonita sighting complained that neither MRL nor officials alerted her and 2 other nearby families to the planned derailment. A Milltown letter writer berated MRL attorney McDonald for his reassurances that the location of the derailment had been intentionally selected, carefully calculated, and made with circumspection of the train cargo. "I am very alarmed at the gross negligence and apparent incompetence of MRL," he wrote, "and think if they were as careful as you claim them to be, then none of this would have happened in the first place. Can you imagine a 107-car runaway train loaded with chlorine tanks piling up in Missoula? This would be a disaster of a magnitude that would cause irreversible damage, effectively turning Missoula into a dead zone." Many people did imagine. Hodges was struck that even Missoulians now had the jitters over MRL's safety record. The runaway train baptized and galvanized the Missoula community in a way the Alberton spill had fallen short. For the most part, Missoula shrugged off Alberton as an accident that never seriously threatened their community. Distant neighbors, Stuff happens. Move on. The Runaway seemed personal. If Missoulians hadn't appreciated that rainy weather helped prevent chlorine from the Alberton spill reaching their city, they understood that this little engine threatened special delivery. Just when Alberton had faded from Missoula's radar as an aberration, the Runaway threw the spotlight on MRL's entire operations, including its safety record and the unknown hazardous cargo routinely hauled. A couple weeks after the second anniversary of the spill in 1998, MRL hosted a special workshop meeting and tour for the local emergency planning committee as fallout continued from the Runaway train. While MRL gave a general outline of their operations, both MRL and the FRA emphasized zero tolerance for accidents. Our policy is, if we find something, we pick it up, Chief Engineer Richard Keller said about defective rail, even beyond what regulations required. MRL President William Brodsky explained that MRL operated 937 miles of mainline track. Brodsky pushed the benefits. MRL had 975 permanent employees with a payroll of $52 million and paid $9 million in state and property taxes while spending $19 million in Missoula County alone for purchases and services. Total revenue, not disclosed, peaked in 1995, he said. In 1996, MRL moved 254,000 carloads of freight with almost 36,000 regulated shipments. Deemed a moving target, chlorine was somewhere in the top 10 of regulated commodities. The meeting was short on specifics regarding hazardous materials and heavy on reassurance that MRL was a safety-conscious and economically valuable partner, a different sort of damage control. In anticipation of the meeting, ACCEH publicized some alternative statistics, gleaned from the 1997 safety data compiled by the FRA, which indicated MRL had the second largest number of accidents for a railroad its size of 18 Class C railroads in 1996. Accidents due to track problems had increased. The data suggested Alberton and the Runaway had not been anomalies, but part of a trend. MRL's peaking revenue in 1995 suggested a cause. With the Runaway train still fresh on everyone's mind, ACCEH broadened its focus to MRL's safety record and saw opportunity to raise public awareness of the threat of toxics rolling through neighborhoods. But the personal quest for Hodges and others remained the same, to find answers to their chronic illness and their ongoing belief that Alberton remained contaminated. While Hodges' symptoms improved after she left Alberton, the health of her children worsened once they returned to school in Missoula. At the beginning of the 1997-98 school year, Trask developed head sores, which spill victims called MRL bumps. Hodges' children complained of headaches and fatigue and caught frequent colds. She thought they were being exposed to chemicals at Hellgate Elementary. I couldn't go to the school, she recalled. I would get sick. It had all the qualities that are bad for people who are environmentally sensitive. New carpets, fresh paint, and daily cleaning chemicals. I could go through that school for 10 minutes and I would be wrecked for days, she said. Hodges now feared she had somewhat neglected her children's symptoms. I don't think that I was paying as much attention as I should have because my own problems were so great, and I made that assumption that the kids weren't suffering as much as I was. It was becoming obvious to her that she and her family could not escape the Alberton spill by running away from Alberton. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Advocates for Alberton spill victims Lisa Mosca and Hope Seek take their video camera to the state capital of Helena, Montana, to interview Tom Ellerhoff, administrative officer for the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, who had oversight on the Alberton spill site remediation. The encounter leaves them in awe. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.